When I was 26, I flew to San Diego for a short visit. I stayed with a friend for several days and booked a late-night flight home. The plane touched down around midnight, and by the time I exited the terminal and reached the ground transportation area, it was close to 12:30 a.m. I flagged down a random cab from the taxi line and gave the driver my home address. He offered to take me for $30, which was a bargain compared to what Uber would have cost. He stepped out to help load my suitcase into the trunk of the van, but I told him it was fine next to me, so he placed it on the seat behind him on the left. I ended up sitting diagonally across from him. He climbed back in, pulled up the directions to my apartment, and we got going. At the time, my place was about 30 minutes away from the airport when there was no traffic. Given the hour, the roads were clear, and we were cruising down the highway. Twice during the ride, I noticed him looking at me in the rearview mirror. The second time, he initiated conversation. He asked where I was flying in from. I told him, San Diego. He replied, nice, and followed up by asking what I was doing there. I said I had gone to see a friend who lived out there. Then came his comment, is your friend as beautiful as you? At first I laughed out of reflex, but it struck me as unsettling. And considering it was only the third thing he'd said, it didn't sit well. After that, his questions took a flirty turn. He asked, what's a pretty girl like you doing traveling all alone? I responded with a bit of edge, well, I just told you I wasn't alone. I was with a friend. He countered by pointing out that since I flew solo, I was technically traveling alone. I held my tone and said, guess we'll just have to disagree on that. He chuckled and said he was only joking around. This man had to be in his mid-40s, and him flirting with a woman in her 20s like this felt creepy. Sadly, it wasn't the first time I'd been in a situation like this. As we continued down the highway, I spotted the overpass that marked the exit near my place, but he wasn't slowing down. I told him, that's my exit, just as he sped past it. I repeated myself louder, emphasizing that he'd just missed the turn. He apologized and said he'd get off at the next exit. I leaned forward to try to see his GPS, curious whether he'd entered the correct address, but the screen was angled away from me. The next exit was about a mile ahead, and I started inching toward the edge of my seat. When we got close, I made it very clear, you need to get off here. Without a word, he flicked on his blinker and exited. I caught him shooting a look at me through the mirror. There was something irritated about it, but he quickly shifted gears and asked, do you have a boyfriend? I immediately responded, yes, he lives with me. He glanced at me again, and I think he picked up on how fast I answered. Then he asked, what's your boyfriend's name? Yes, seriously, that was the final straw. I told him I was going to put my headphones in and slipped in my AirPods, even though they were nearly dead. I just needed him to stop talking to me. That question about my boyfriend's name felt invasive, almost like an interrogation. I texted my family and close friends, letting them know about the creepy cab driver and shared my location in case anything went wrong. We were now approaching familiar streets in my town and stopped at our first red light since exiting the highway. I glanced up and saw him glaring at me in a way that felt genuinely threatening. I hadn't been listening to music, so I knew he hadn't said anything. He was just staring. When the light turned green, he kept looking at me. I finally had to say, "The light's green." He then started driving again. Only my older brother replied to my texts. He was likely the only one awake. He lived 2 hours away and told me to get out of the car if I felt unsafe. We were on one of the main roads through town, but it was deserted. It was nearly 1 a.m. on a weeknight. At the next red light, I felt his stare again. That's when I noticed a police cruiser parked in an empty lot nearby. Without overthinking it, I grabbed my suitcase and backpack, yanked open the van door, and jumped out. He began yelling, "What are you doing?" He tried shutting the door using the van's automatic control, but I forced it open and, the moment there was enough room, bolted straight toward the police vehicle. Rather than getting out or chasing me for payment, he just drove off. Another massive red flag. Once I saw him drive away, I slowed to a fast walk toward the police car. The officer inside noticed me, rolled down the window, and I told him the cab driver had made me extremely uncomfortable and that I got out for my own safety. I asked if he could take me home, and thankfully, he said, "Hop in the back." Being a frightened woman probably helped, but I don't recommend asking cops to play chauffeur. That's not their job. By the time I got in, the cab was long gone. The officer drove me home. It only took 5 to 10 minutes. I let myself in, skipped unpacking, brushed my teeth, and collapsed into bed. But just as I got under the covers, there was a knock at my front door. Was it the cab driver? He had my address. What if he came back for money? Or worse. The knocking continued for a while, then stopped, then started again. I stayed in my room, far from the door. It was locked, and that's all that mattered. Eventually, the knocking stopped, and I managed to fall asleep. The next day, I went to work. Thankfully, I had a later shift and didn't need to wake up early. While I was there, my neighbor George called. He said my dad had stopped by earlier to drop something off but didn't have a key. George just wanted to check if I had been expecting him. I said no. I hadn't heard from my dad. George mentioned that he didn't see him leave anything, just peered in through the windows, which he found strange. I thanked him and called my dad. As I suspected, he was at work and hadn't come by. I filled him in on the whole cab situation again, this time over the phone. He asked me to come stay at their place for a few nights. I agreed, but needed to go home first to pack. After work, I got home around 9 p.m., finished up some laundry, and threw some clothes and work supplies into a bag. Still, something about the apartment felt off. I'm not usually spooked being alone, but that night I couldn't shake the sense that someone else was there. It may have been nerves from the night before, but I kept hearing faint creaks, like the subtle shift of weight on old wood. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I was getting more and more uneasy and tried to speed up packing. Right as I was about to leave, I heard a creaking sound coming from down the hall, from the guest room. Then a voice, "I wasn't going to hurt you." And an arm appeared from around the corner. I ran. I didn't wait for him to step into view. I tore out of my apartment and banged on George's door, screaming. Thankfully, it was early enough that he and his wife were still awake. They rushed outside as I begged for help. Rather than go back inside, we called 911 and waited for police before doing anything else. My apartment isn't huge, so the officers searched it quickly. The back sliding door that led to the shared backyard was open, suggesting he'd escaped that way. Unfortunately, I had no proof of the cab ride, no receipt, no car number, nothing. All I could provide was a description of the yellow minivan and the man. I did explain the route we took and the approximate time I arrived in town, hoping police could check local surveillance footage. With my bags already packed, I headed to my parents' house and stayed for a week. They wanted me to stay longer, but I eventually had to return to my normal life. My dad helped me install Amazon security cameras on the front and back doors. I also bought a taser to keep next to my bed, just in case. Since that experience, I've lived in 2 different apartments. Thankfully, I've never had to use the taser. I also avoid taking regular taxis when I'm alone. They're harder to trace than ride-share apps. And stories of people being abducted by fake cab drivers are disturbingly common. Sometimes I still wonder, was that even a real taxi driver? Or was the van stolen?